Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to episode 4 of the Bonnot Gang series. Today we'll be reading chapter 4 of the Bonnot Gang by Richard Perry, Anarchy in Suburbia. My panel right now is Lane and Many Dog and CSD. What's up, guys?
Not
What's up?
much.
Howdy. I made it
You
back in
came
time. Yes.
just
Uh,
in time.
just in time. But yeah, it's good having you guys on. I guess we may as well get right into it and start with the reading. Okay, chapter 4, Anarchy in Suburbia. Instead of wasting time chatting, it will be better to start the revolution inside oneself and realize it according to the best of our abilities in partial experiments, wherever such an opportunity arises, and whenever a bold group of our comrades have the conviction and the courage to try them. Luigi Galliani, 1861 to 1931. The move. The antagonism between the Lanarchy comrades and Paraf Javal's scientific studies group had subsided in the wake of Libertad's death, only to be replaced by a quarrel with Le Libertaire. In November, fighting broke out between the two factions, and one winter evening, the windows of 22 Rue de la Barre were smashed in. The rupture between the individualists and the other anarchists was becoming more and more violent, and the mainstream anarchist and syndicalist journals Temp Nouveau, Le Libertaire, and Guerre Sociale were declaring their intention of getting the Causerie Populaire group off their backs once and for all. In the summer of 1910, the old quarrel with Paraf Javal flared up again. One night, Lorelou and Dutilleux surprised Maurice Duflo, the ex-editor, trying to steal away with most of the printing equipment from the basement of 22 Rue de la Barre. They threw him out and said that his furniture and belongings would be kept until he returned the 2,000 francs worth of printing material that he'd taken. Two comrades, Lorenzi and Leroux, were put on guard. At 6 in the morning on Sunday, May 8th, two trucks drew up outside 22 Rue de la Barre. In them were Paraf Javal, his son, and a dozen other men. They jumped out of their trucks and broke into the ground floor of the building. Fighting ensued on the second floor, and shots were fired by the defenders, leaving one of Paraf Javal's group dead and another seriously injured. The attackers withdrew and summoned the police, who arrived and arrested the 5 comrades inside: Lomont, Lorenzi, Lahourt, Dutilleux, and Bunin. They in turn demanded that Paraf Javal, Duflo, and the others be arrested for theft, housebreaking, and aggravated burglary. But the police were unmoved. In retaliation for their dead comrade, the scientific studies group now threatened to blow up the premises. The owner thought that such a threat was not to be taken lightly, and gave the Lanarchy group notice to quit before the start of July. Meanwhile, the Lanarchy 5 were charged with the fray and released on bail to appear before the Seine-Assis in October. After an article by Paraf Javal appeared in La Matin, the conservative daily, Lorelot gathered up 40 comrades to enforce his demand for a right of reply. At 1 in the morning, the editor felt it might be unwise to refuse their request, and a reply duly appeared. There was still the problem of having to move. In the morning, the editor felt it might be unwise to refuse their request. There was still a problem of having to move, however, and the threats of retaliation. Lorelou felt that it might be better to leave Paris altogether, and came up with the idea of moving to the suburbs, which appealed to him as a lover of nature. In the last week of June 1910, the seat of Lanarchy was transferred to 16 Rue de Bagnolet, in the leafy suburb of Romainville, east of the city. Victor Kovalchich had managed to keep out of the internecine strife between the warring anarchist factions, despite being a reasonably prominent figure in the individualist milieu. He had a front-page article in Lanarchy the week after the affray and chaired a meeting on idealism at the Rue de la Barre in June. Fortunately, he lived some distance from Montmartre and so avoided the trouble that plagued the Rue de la Barre. When Laurelud and the others departed for Romainville, Victor stayed on in Paris to organize a Causerie Populaire group in the Quartier Latin. Le Libre Recherche, Free Enquiry, Sociological Study Circle of the Latin Quarter first met in September 1910 in the Café de Bourg, in the Rue des Carmes. Victor, alongside Lorillot, now took over from Mauritius as the main speaker of the Causerie Populaire circuit. Rirette introduced Victor to an 18-year-old grocer boy she'd met in a bar frequented by anarchists in the Latin Quarter. Victor described him as a perfect example of the crushed childhood of the back alleys. He grew up on the street, TB at 13, VD at 18. He was later to become infamous as the man with the rifle, but for the moment he was just the shy, nervous, and pale-faced Andre Saudi, who liked taking Rirette's two daughters for walks in the Luxembourg Gardens. His father was a plasterer and ex-innkeeper in Beaugency. Lorillot, who had sent Andre to work at 11 as a grocer's boy in a local store. At 16, he was working a 15-hour day in Orleans, despite the fact he had tuberculosis and was beginning to spit blood. The French suffered from TB more than any other European nation, and the incidence was especially high in northern France. In poor areas, up to 25% of all school children suffered from it, and the death rate was 80% higher than average. Kovalchich recalled, even the bitterest joking helped to keep him living, convinced as he was that he was not long for this world, seeing the price of medicine. As soon as he turned 18 in February 1910, Andre departed for Paris, where he found a little room in the Rue de Bourdonnais next to the huge market in Les Halles. He eventually found a job at the Socialist Grocers Cooperative, Egalitaire, in the Rue Mouffetard, not far from Victor's and Rirette's lodgings. Occasionally he would pass boxes of lobsters to comrades, or give housewives double measures, just so that he could see the surprised looks on their faces. While Anarchy had moved outside Paris, other comrades continued the interventions within the city. Royalist, syndicalist, and Christian Democrat meetings were all seen as legitimate targets. The anarchists would form a battle square in one corner of the hall and demand the right to speak. Such a demand being habitually refused, heckling, jeering, and whistling would commence. Such interventions normally ended up in fighting with the Catholic or Union stewards or the Royalist Camelot du Roi thugs. Victor Kovalchich, René Vallet, and Andre Saudi often went along to these meetings together. Rirette recalled Andre standing at the back of the balcony at one meeting and shouting out, "You're a nutter," as the first politician came up to speak. There was laughter from those in the balcony. When the next speaker stood up, Saudi cried, "You're another nutter," more hilarity from the audience. By the time the third speaker had risen only to be insulted, the whole audience was crying, "Nutter, nutter." On 10th October, the trial of the 5 comrades from the Rue de la Barre, indicted with affray and lesser charges, began at the Palais de Justice. The defense lawyer was Gustave Hervé's secretary, Boucheron, who made his name on such trials. Amongst the defense witnesses were some who were to figure in later events surrounding the Bonnot gang affair. Mallet, Collin, Fromentin, and Dubois, of the latter two. The first was the reputed anarchist millionaire and philanthropist. The other was an auto mechanic with a garage at Choisy-le-Roi. The case lasted 3 days. Lahert and Lorenzi got 5 years. Bunin 3 months for carrying a prohibited weapon, a 9mm Browning semi-automatic. And Lorillot and Dutilleux were freed. Paraf-Javal's crew had never been charged, and it was suspected by some that he had used his influence as a Freemason to get all the charges dumped on the Rue de la Barre group. 2 weeks after the trial, the Lanarchy comrades staged an intervention at a Freemasons conference, which resulted in uproar. Victor Kovalchich defended their actions in an article in Lanarchy entitled, "Shut the Mouths of the Red Jesuits." He was for the systematic obstruction of speakers at public meetings, and for more combative interventions generally. Lorillot, on the other hand, was against too much aggression as it tended to prevent their ideas getting across. In January 1911, events in the East End of London, namely the siege of Sydney Street, attracted the attention of the anarchist individualists. Members of a Latvian revolutionary cell, part of the Liesma network which carried out the Tottenham holdup in 1909, were engaged in an expropriation of a jeweler's in Houndsditch when they were discovered by the police. They shot their way out, leaving 3 policemen dead and 2 wounded. but in the confusion accidentally shot their own leader. This mishap led to two comrades being traced to Sydney Street. Rather than surrender, the two men did battle with 700 police and dozens of soldiers, dying only when the house caught fire and burnt to the ground. Victor Kovalchich felt it necessary to comment in extenso on such resistance to the state, and so the old myth went, socially Pacific England. His article was entitled simply Two Men. In the ordinary sense of the word, we cannot and will not be honest. By definition, the anarchist lives by expediency. Work for him is a deplorable expedient, just like stealing. He chooses the methods of struggle, according to his power and circumstance. He takes no account of any conventions which safeguard property. For him, force alone counts. Thus we have neither to approve nor disapprove of illegal actions. We say they are logical. The anarchist is always illegal, theoretically. The sole word anarchist means rebellion in every sense. We want total rebellion. Our logic, free from the last traditional sophisms, tells us that the rebel will only be impeded in the economic field if he accepts the legal and moral considerations he rejects elsewhere. Determined people accept the risk. The thought of reprisals renders them at one, at the same time more wary, more audacious, and more decisive in persevering to the finish. Reprisals, when they do occur, spread combativity. The magnificent resistance of the Russian comrades killed in London has stirred the enthusiasm of rebels everywhere. It constitutes an example of courage and determination, from which all the tramps have drawn strength, and all the undisciplined will draw profit. They did well to defend themselves until death. They acted as every rebel should act in the same circumstances. It can never be repeated too often. The slightest blow delivered against an individual legitimates on their part the use of all methods of struggle. Pacific, benign people, you will see again this nightmare. 1,000 brutes hurling themselves against two men. You will see again often, more and more often, the numberless pack of police and soldiers hunting the rebels, being held in check by a few lone individuals. His use of the future tense was indeed to be prophetic. The battle lines were being drawn. The Paris prefecture de police wholeheartedly supported the action of the English authorities. The means adopted for the reduction of such redoubtable bandits to impotence are the only ones that ought to be employed. The socialist response was varied. Humanity called them bandits whose mentality was capitalist. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party agreed with the English democracy in denouncing them as criminal hooligans. One socialist who did eulogize the resistance at Sydney Street was the editor of Pagine Liberaire, Benito Mussolini. Victor continued to stay in Paris and chaired meetings with Lorillot against socialism on the eve of war and anarchism and the old parties. Some were held at the Université Populaire with the singing of revolutionary and popular Montmartre songs and theater group performances. The anarchist individualist milieu was quite lively, with groups being dotted about all over France, and information about them appearing on the back page of L'Anarchy. So it's the end of that part. Thoughts so far?
It's very interesting to see, like we've been seeing, like throughout the previous chapters, how like the antagonisms between the syndicalists and the other anarchists against the egoists has just been boiling over, and I think it was just bound to happen because the syndicalists still want like a form of a form of order, while the egoists do not.
Mm-hmm. Even the early anarchists wanted a form of order. Proudhon wanted a form of order. The entire point is anarchy is order. People have no morality, and so they're able to govern themselves. That's the original idea.
Right. It's just a different organizing of society, other than like the government and like capitalism, like private property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The idea is that society slowly moves away from hierarchy and becomes less and less of a necessity, thus anarchy is inevitable.
Yeah, it's organization based on like voluntary associations rather than a state forcing people to do things they don't want to do.
Yeah.
You know,
Which I kind of disagree. I think like civilization always like centralizes in the end.
Well, you
Like,
can just
it will
look
be
at the history of
centralized at times,
America
and
and
they'll
see that.
yeah, it's a too bad that Americans don't see that. They just don't see it like they only talk about one or the other. Like they'll either talk about government bureaucratization or corporate bureaucratization, but not both at the same time. Very few do, and it's mostly
They
people.
sort of go hand in hand.
Yeah, they do. They complement the other,
Mhm.
but not in all cases. Like in China, I wouldn't say it. It's the same.
You gotta make, if you have a true supremacy of the state like you have in China, that's not the case. In America, the state is ultimately subordinate to capital.
Yeah, that is very true.
And if you doubt that, there's data by Martin Gilligan's. I can show it to you.
I'm not disagreeing with you.
Yeah, I was just saying, if anyone doubts that.
Is that why the symbolism of the A's representing anarchy is like the circle with it outside the
The
A's?
order
That's
is,
supposed to
that
represent order.
represents order. The A represents anarchy. Anarchy is order,
Okay.
which the egoists rejected, which is why I deny them the title of anarchist. They're like a post-anarchist.
Also, I kind of had to tap out for a second to go grab my dog, and I heard something about Mussolini. Did he support the egoists, or did he like support like the other?
He eulogized the resistance.
at Sydney Street. Yeah, that kind of surprised me. I like this is the first time I've read it. I didn't pre-read this week,
Well,
so
It also stated before that Maurice Barres, who was a French nationalist and a proto-fascist, was an egoist for a time.
yeah. So there's people on like the authoritarian right who are kind of sympathetic to this kind of direct action and
I wonder what
utilization
Sorrell thought of it.
I'm not sure. Doesn't
I don't know
mention.
Sorrell specifically, but last time I was on, when I was on the shitpost stream, I needed to pick a profile picture. I picked a random file, and it was a Jewish reactionary who happened to be gay, but he took a lot of Max Stirner's criticisms of Christianity.
Who was it?
Bonnot, Benedict Feilander. He was a writer for Der Eigene.
Oh, that's interesting. I never heard of him.
Yeah, I'm not familiar either.
He gave a nationalist argument for homosexuality, which I thought was funny.
What was his argument? Just curious.
Well, the strength of the nation is built on bonds. The bonds of the nation is not so much the bonds of the whole nation, but the bonds of specific individuals. So thus, when you have male bonding, homosexuality is a common consequence. To put laws and prejudge against homosexuality thus weakens that bond that's being created.
I know of a Jewish homosexual which I don't know if we'd call him a reactionary, but he's very similar. His name was Kurt Hiller, and he collaborated with Otto Strasser and Karl Otto Patel and Ernest Niekisch. He had sympathies for
Feilander was a reactionary, but I say he was. He felt the West has been in decline ever since Christianity and wanted to go back to Greek and Rome.
I'd say like Kurt Hiller is probably part of like the conservative revolution, particularly like the national revolutionaries.
You could say the same about Feilander, but whatever. I don't care for labels.
Yeah.
Also, to bring it back, like everything I've read from Sorrell, he doesn't like seem like much of an egoist. So I assume he'd spark the syndicalists.
No, he's not an egoist at all. Like he has a lot of. He's like, yeah, like you said, he's a syndicalist, and he also has admiration for religion too.
Mm-hmm.
So,
even like social conservatism.
Yeah,
does.
Some like really socially conservative takes for like a libertarian socialist.
Mm-hmm.
I know
he notes that like social conservatism in this time of degeneracy could be a route which revolution takes. A road.
He kind of Sorrell kind of reminds me of like a lot of the conservative revolutionaries in the way they're like the old system that was conservative, while it had good parts to it, it failed, and we just need something new to preserve the things we hold dear.
Mm-hmm.
Dude, I'm going to grab some water quick. I'll be right back. Talk amongst yourselves.
Okay. But yeah, I actually haven't read Sorrel. I just read a few parts, and that one popped in my mind.
Oh, I can
So
give you some stuff by Sorrel if you want me to.
I have stuff by him. I
Oh.
uploaded some stuff to my channel.
Oh, okay.
You saw the decomposition of Marxism.
Yeah.
I uploaded that there.
Funny enough, I one of my first books introducing me to like radical politics was by Sorrel. At the time, I didn't understand it, but I recently just like went back to it, and I actually enjoyed it a lot, and I agreed with it a lot. Now I'm reading like Illusion of Progress by Sorrel.
I should probably read that. That's the point where he rejects Marxist materialist dialectics.
In truth, from everything I've read from him, he doesn't seem like a Marxist at all, other than like an Engel, like in a classless society, because he never talks about dialectical materialism and reflections on violence. He always just talks about myth, like in like a grand narrative that leads the working class into revolution,
Well, I
like the
would
general
describe
strike.
myth as like a grand narrative. It's a single sort of idea that leads to revolutionary action.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
A grand idea, the end goal, like, I don't know, socialism, that would be utopia in Sorrel's view.
Oh, that is a good point. That's a good correction to what I was saying. But
yeah, it's utopia and myth. Myth is a single idea that leads to revolutionary action, like a strike.
Right. He also connects that with like Christianity and martyrdom too, like in Reflections on Violence.
Should I continue reading or?
Yeah, sure.
We're kind of getting off topic.
Yeah. The Romainville Commune. Anarchy was now being published by comrades living in a large detached house in the suburb of Romainville, 2 kilometers northeast of Paris. It could be reached quite easily by tram from Concord, Opera, Republique, or Bastille, or by train to the station, which stood almost opposite. The house itself had a basement, ground, and 2 upper floors. There was a courtyard and extensive garden with fruit and lilac trees. The rent had been settled at 800 francs for the first year and 1,000 francs thereafter. Romainville had the atmosphere of a country village and still retained some of the charm that had led Victor Hugo to describe it as a place where young lovers went to gather lilac in April. Romainville was soon to become the home of the comrades from Brussels. Victor Kobalchich, Raymond Talaman, Jean de Beau, Edward Caroy, and the French draft dodger Octave Garnier. Jean de Beau was first to arrive. At the end of 1910 via Switzerland and Marseille, where he'd been wrongly arrested for theft. Raymond arrived in February 1911, although he had visited previously. Edouard, Octave, and Mary seemed to have turned up, maybe together in April. There were warrants out for both men for their suspected involvement in a burglary in Charleroi the month before, during which a gendarme had been shot. In Romainville, Edward met up with a small, dark-haired Italian anarchist, Jean Bellardi, née Botelli, during one of those pleasant Sunday afternoon open-air meetings at Rue de Bagnolet. She was cultivated but temperamental. According to Rirette, she was married to Brutus Bellardi, who was doing a 5-year stretch in Melun prison for forging 10-franc pieces. She came to Anarchy to find companionship and support for her 4-year-old daughter. She found both in Edward Caroy. René Vallet also came to live in Romainville in the spring or summer of 1911 with his companion, Anna Dondon, at 26 years old from Decize, Nivre. She was on parole from Rennes prison after a second sentence, 5 years this time, for circulating false 10-franc pieces. She had come to Paris with her brother and met the comrades of L'Anarchie among the René Vallet. Her daughter, however, was still being looked after by her parents in Decize. Victor and Laurent moved into 16 Rue de Bagnolet in the summer of 1911, bringing the 2 children, Maud and Jeanette, with them. Amour libre, free love, was certainly practiced in anarchist circles as part of the struggle against the dependence and slavery of bourgeois marriage. Victor, Edouard, and Octave were all consorting with married women, two of whose husbands were imprisoned for counterfeiting, a popular practice amongst anarchists, and three of whom had children by their previous relationships. Still, despite the much proclaimed demand for female emancipation, Rirette could say that amongst the anarchists, rarely is the woman's opinion asked. Whether bourgeois, worker, or rebel, the activity of the man was still very much the focus of attention. The editor of L'Anarchy, Laura Laud, was also consorting with the married woman, Louise Dudon, nicknamed the Red Venus, a play no doubt on Louise Michel's moniker, the Red Virgin. She was married to a joiner from Nancy, strong mustachioed Eugene Dudon, an anarchist ever since the age of 15. He had seen his best friend clubbed into the gutter by police during a strike. Eugene had done his military service, unlike the other comrades at Romainville, but had spent half his time in prison for insulting his superior officers and for making anti-militarist propaganda. When he was demobbed in 1907, he married Louise and a child. Jeannot was born the following year. He was happy enough in his work, but Louise desperately wanted to see Paris and convinced him to leave Nancy. In the spring of 1908, they found a flat near Bastaille, and he began work in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. Louise loved the city, but it did not suit Eugene at all. To her, he now seemed rather ordinary compared to the vigorous young rebels, or the more thoughtful intellectual types, that she met at the Causerie Populaire. An affair developed between her and Lorillot, and after some anguish, she left Eugene to live with Lorillot in Romainville. He felt helpless, faced with the power of love and his anarchist principles. On 6th June, he returned to Nancy and took his infant son to his mother's. In Romainville, matinee and soiree were held in the garden virtually every other Sunday, especially after spring had come and the weather was fine. There would be discussions, eating, drinking, and lazing about on the grass, and the habitual singing of revolutionary and popular folk songs, or the reciting of passages of prose and poetry. The principles of communal life at Rue de Bagnolet revolved around la vie naturelle, the natural life. It was a common enough idea at the time, and found expression in such groups as the naturists, the savages, and the nomads, all living out their particular interpretation of la vie naturelle. Living in libertarian communes, or life on the road, sometimes traveling in groups of over 100 people, were part of the experience of many anarchists. Large groups of Bohemians traveled around Central Europe and France in convoys up to 60 caravans strong. They lived partially by stealing, altering stolen horses in much the same way as Bonnot was to bring stolen cars. They were forbidden to stay in towns and were constantly harassed by the authorities. Occasionally, the police would round up a whole group, arrest and photograph them, and note down their names, which were almost certainly aliases. Then they'd be released and told to move on. Lorillot, Libertad, and Zoe Daxa all praised this marginal existence as anti-capitalist. Victor, Raymond, and Edward had belonged to the colony in the forest of Soignes, and Lorillot had lived for some time with the Libertarian Commune at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just outside Paris. Apparently, one of his favorite activities was wandering naked through the woods. In Romainville, however, la vie naturelle was given a scientific basis. Raymond, Octave, Edouard, Renee, and presumably their female companions, Mary, Jeanne, and Anna, adopted a diet akin to Lorillot's, but based on scientific rather than natural principles. The communal table was often spread with cuisine. Lorillot, a typical meal being brown rice or maize porridge, a milky soup, scraped vegetables, and macaroni cheese, all highly flavored. Anti-scientific substances such as salt, pepper, and vinegar were never used. Some vegetables were homegrown in the back garden by an ex-con called Hugh, who also looked after the chickens and pet ducks and rabbits. Vegetarianism was the order of the day, while some comrades also experimented with fruitarianism. As for beverages, tea and coffee were avoided in preference to water. and alcohol was completely shunned. Besides tuberculosis, the other killer disease of the working class was chronic alcoholism. The anarchist attitude was that alcohol dulled the senses of workers to their exploitation and was therefore another weapon in the arsenal of capitalism. Alcoholism was a sort of materialized form of the Christian-induced attitude of resignation. So here's a picture of these guys, the young Parisians, top left, Octave Garnier, one of the principal gang members, top right, Marie Roman Garnier's lover, bottom left, Andre Saudi, known to friends as Passe the Chance, bottom right, Rene Vallée, who would meet his fate at Nogent. All the men were to die before reaching their mid-20s. Keeping fit was seen as important both for general health reasons and in case of brushes with the police. Tobacco smoking was definitely out. Comrades look up the latest Swedish exercises and also went for long walks and cycle rides. Louise, Rirette, Raymond, Edward, Mary, and Octave would get up early on Sunday mornings and cycle down to the River Marne at Nogent. There they would hire a boat or two and drift along, while Louise sang Edward's favorite sentimental old love song, an old romantic at heart. Edward liked to buy caged birds and set them free. He hated the idea of imprisonment of any creature, human or not. As they lazed about on the river, Octave and Mary were obviously unaware that destiny would bring them back to the place under rather different circumstances. At the time, it was very à la mode in anarchist circles to possess a 9mm Browning semi-automatic. They were quite easily obtainable, being manufactured at the Fabrique Nationale d'Armes de Guerre in Hurstville, Belgium. They were rarely used, however. Comrades simply tended to be picked up for carrying a prohibited weapon and given 3 months in jail. This didn't deter Octave, Edward, and Rene Vallée from conducting target practice in the back garden at Romainville, something which, coupled with the nocturnal activities, made Lorelot extremely anxious and led to several arguments. One major topic of discussion was the importance of science. It was held that science, by teaching that it was possible not just to comprehend, but also to change one's environment, could counter the dominant attitude of resignation to the current order of things. At the time, a belief in the impartiality of science was bound up with the old idea of progress and the general climate of discovery, experimentation, and change that had accompanied the expansion of capitalism. Some anarchists suggested that scientific law should regulate the whole life of the new man to the exclusion of irrational sentiment, emotion, and idealism. Reason was to replace faith, much as the old 19th century philosophies had suggested. But this time, the discoveries of science would allow more practical, material applications of reason to everyday life. The ideas of Buchner, Haeckel, and above all, Felix de Ledantec were discussed incessantly. Ledantec was a determinist, biologist, and philosophical rationalist in the tradition of the great biologist Lamarck, but his ideas were marked by an extremely mechanistic conception of life. He had published books on sexuality and atheism, which would put him in favor with the individualists. And in 1911, he brought out a volume entitled Egoism, Foundation of All Society. He declared, life is an absolutely egotistical act, and the living being is in struggle against the entire universe. It is enemy of everything outside of it, words rather reminiscent of Stirner. Victor Kovalchitz, however, grew annoyed at the direction these discussions were taking. Taine and Renan's blind cult of science, here reduced to almost algebraic formulae by fanatical popularizers, became the catechism of the individualist revolt. The doctrine of comradely living slightly counteracted the unpardonable isolation of these rebels, but out of it was emerging a constricted coterie equipped with a psychological jargon demanding a long initiation. I found this coterie at once fascinating and repellent. Nevertheless, Kovalchitz himself was not totally averse to using scientific arguments in his polemics. At the end of one article in 1911, he suggested that anarchists destroy by all means that science has provided. Raymond was said to be leading the light of the scientific individualists and acquired his nickname Raymond Le Science. From the way that he habitually began sentences, La science dit, or La science affirme. This coterie cannot have been very big, however, as Victor and Rirette were not part of it, and Edward apparently used to get irritated and tell Raymond to shut up. Rene seems to have said little, and Octave just put up with them. Unfortunately, Laroulat, although he could quite happily share their scientific diet, could not stomach their illegalist ideas, and more to the point, their actions. Already concerned about the target shooting, he was worried that sooner or later some of their burglaries would be traced back to l'Anarchy. Rirette said later that Laroulat was never an illegalist in words or deeds. After several arguments, he decided to return to Paris, and there set up his own magazine, but as nominal editor of l'Anarchy, he would need a replacement. Victor Kobalchich was the obvious choice. He was an old friend of the scientific-cum-illegalist group from Brussels, with which he shared ideas, or so it seemed in print, and he was a regular contributor to l'Anarchy and a leading speaker at the Causerie Populaire. In fact, it was Rirette's name that appeared on the front page as the nominal editor. Perhaps Laroulat felt that making her liable for the contents of the paper would have a calming effect on some of the fiery young men who were being rather too careless with their words and actions. On July 13, 1911, the first issue appeared bearing Henriette Maitre-Jean's name on the cover. 2 weeks later, it was explained, "Our situation is very precarious. There was no money coming in, and a malaise reigned amongst their friends. Laroulat, it was said, had left for personal reasons, but would continue to help." The Romainville commune now consisted of the four couples, Octave Garnier and Marie, Edward Caroy and Jeanne, Victor and Rirette, Anna and Rene Vallee, their three children, Hugh the gardener and Raymond Calaman. A frequent guest was Marius Medge, a friend and associate in crime of Edward's. He was a draft dodger who had escaped to England and may have had a hand in the anti-militarist manifesto from London that appeared in the pages of l'Anarchy. He was nicknamed Le Cuisinier, Cookie or the Cook, as he'd been an assistant cook in Paris before his call-up papers had arrived. Burglary was now his chosen profession. Nicknames were traditional amongst criminals and were adopted by anarchists for much the same reasons, to avoid being traced or identified by the police or their informers. Thus, Octave Garnier was Le Terressier, the Navy. Edward Caroy was Le Rouquin, Ginger. Victor Le Retif, Raymond Le Science, Medge Le Cuisinier, and Mary Le Belge. The other women were simply Le Bellardi, Jean and La Dondon Anna after their surnames. While Victor scribbled away writing and translating, Raymond was made treasurer and also helped Jean de Beau with the typography. Jean, however, soon left to help Laroulat with his new magazine. Garnier and Caroy lived on the first floor and worked the printing press. Octave also helped Huck in the garden and baked most of the bread. The four women seemed to have done most of the cooking. Rirette alone of the four did translations, wrote articles, and chaired meetings. The three children were taken care of in communal fashion. Rene Vallee helped out generally in the print shop. On the second floor was a large shower room and a graffiti-covered room for travelers. In keeping with the anarchist ethic of obligatory hospitality for comrades in need, causerie continued to be held in the garden at 16 Rue de Bagnolet on Sundays in July and August. Victor talked on individualism and the social question, and there was a discussion on the freedom of love. On 20th August, there was an excursion starting from the Gare du Nord at 7 a.m. to Engine for an anarchist picnic. Still, despite these comradely affairs and Laroulat's departure, new tensions arose amongst the comrades living at Romainville. So that's the end of that part. Thoughts on natural living and like these anarchist communes. They remind me of like hippie communes of the 60s and like they were like free love and nudism.
Only these people were a little bit more disciplined. They also emphasized exercise and fitness, no alcoholism, no drugs, no tobacco.
That's what I was going to bring it up. I find it very I find that difference between anarchists back then and now to be like very interesting. I wonder why they believe not. Well, they did say why they didn't like alcoholism, but I wonder what made anarchists change that. Like more liberty, I'm assuming, like to do what you want.
The more libertarian minded, I guess, the less disciplined as people. That's what I would blame it on. Just less disciplined as people. But anyways, the notes about scientific and guiding life being guided by science, like Bakunin wrote against that in his response to Marx. If you want, I can like find it. I have my book from Bakunin over on that bookshelf.
I'd be willing to hear it if you can find
Yeah.
it.
I know Sorrell did too.
I'll just grab it real sick.
Yeah, these communes also kind of remind me of like the crust punk squatter scene, though like they definitely don't do the clean living.
The fitness.
It also kind of reminds me of the proto-anarchist group, the Diggers, which were very similar. Like they were like agrarian communes, but they were more religious.
Yeah, it seems to have
Bakunin on Anarchy. It's an essay near the end here.
based. Yeah. I also see parallels with like the straight edge scene because like they do have the clean living and vegetarianism, veganism. Though I wouldn't say they were vegans, but like they did care about animals and nature and stuff like
too
that.
far apart.
Yeah. Well, they're closely linked, especially in the 90s with bands like Vegan Reich and Earth Crisis. They definitely put like animal liberation and stuff front and center. I'm a big fan of those bands. But yeah, any other thoughts on
I hate trying to like find the quote. I guess I'll just send it to you. The essay's on anarchism.org too. You can read it.
Yeah.
But
if you can find it, I'd be willing to hear it. But if
it's
not,
a life guided by science will be boring and authoritative. But he's responding specifically to Marx. These people don't want to put science test at the front and center of life and have life guided by scientists, which is what Bakunin was responding to.
Yeah. Personal thoughts on the scientific worldview or whatever, what have you?
Not particularly. I mean, like I don't literally see how my life is guided by science. That's like an authoritative question.
Technocracy, I guess.
It can be useful at times, but it's not like a religion or anything. I'm not one of those people who are like, I love science. Science changes a lot over time, and it can't solve all problems.
I can't help but think of like some like libtard with a "I fucking love science" shirt and his jaw like dragging off the floor. That's what it makes me think of. You know the meme I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know.
And just because like we get like better technology doesn't mean our life becomes better in certain other ways. Like I know a lot of people who critique progress always say that. I talk about that, like when it comes to like alienation and the breakdown of the family and things of that nature.
Yeah.
The futurists, since this is a futurist channel, they were in support of like phasing out the family. They also endorsed free love. We know from Fume a lot of them were also into like nudism and free love and stuff like that.
Yeah,
they thought children should be raised in state institutions and they wanted to get rid of the family. So
yeah. They were also pro-war, which separates them from a lot of other progressives like Virgin Russell or Francis Fukuyama.
These guys were basically that we're reading about. They were basically pacifists and like anti-war. So that's a clear distinction.
The futurists were like Nietzscheanism on steroids.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, that's like the one thing like both like anti-progressives and futurists kind of agree on is that like as technology progresses, war does get more violent. It's just that one's against like this technological progression and against this like technological war, and the others are for it.
Well, as war gets more violent, the cost of war becomes higher, and so war becomes less common.
This too. More small scale. We haven't really had like a total war since World War II. You know, just like proxy wars and like military conflicts.
war has greatly decreased in size because if you have wars like you used to, you're gonna end up with like a bunch of dead people.
Yeah, they'd be
As the-
devastating.
I feel like nuclear warfare is like more of a contributing factor.
Yeah, it is. That's why war becomes more costly.
Yeah,
That's
And
one
other stuff too,
reason.
like
And you
biological
look
weapons.
at a lot of nations, like North Korea develops nukes specifically to just ward off imperialism. That's the whole point of their nuclear program.
And that's what Iran's trying to do now, if I'm
Mhm.
not mistaken.
Yeah. Because if someone has nukes, they could launch it, and then it creates a whole mess.
Yeah,
You
and
ever
it's the
think
same
there's gonna
thing
be
with
like
chemical weapons, but just on a smaller scale.
Mhm.
what were you
no, you ever
saying
think
there,
there's gonna be
John?
like a technology that's gonna like negate nuclear warfare one day?
Probably, by the nature of
Eventually.
technology, it continues to progress and progress. But it's going to get to a point where, like I said, war has already become less and less common. The cost of war is becoming higher. You need to do war differently. You have to be careful of not picking the wrong fights.
But it seems like wars are also being drawn out longer too, like
Yeah.
because we were in Iraq and Afghanistan for a really long time, and we're just now
I
starting to
was
finally
born
pull out
when
of.
we went in, and I'm on my own now.
I was in high school when 9/11 happened. I was 14.
I was born a few years after 9/11. I was born in the middle of the start of the Iraq War,
Mhm.
like right
Yeah,
after the invasion.
I'm an old man. I definitely went to some of the anti-war protests in Toronto back then. Um,
Mhm.
I was still a leftist, so I did shit like that. Um, and yeah, like I was kind of anti-war, anti-authoritarianism as a moral absolute. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, kind of along the same lines as these guys, though I definitely didn't care for the straight edge lifestyle and clean living and all that. In that respect, I haven't really changed. I don't care about that shit. But I think it's basically positive, though. Like I'm not going to counter signal it, to each their own. Um,
Mhm.
whatever works for you. You know, some people just don't like engaging in that stuff. More
Like
to
I
them.
said, I don't drink. I don't
Yeah,
smoke. I said that before, and that's something
It's
that's
the
been
same.
handed down because that's what I was taught when I was young. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't cuss. Can speak
Damn, I do
safely.
all those things.
yeah, me too. Um, yeah. Any final thoughts on the communal lifestyle, or before we continue reading?
Uh, it's not for me.
Yeah,
I would like it. I would like to live on a commune.
it's a nice idea, but leading into the next section, yeah, they usually don't last too long. They fall apart within a couple years.
Yeah.
Um, there are a lot of like intentional communities that we could bring up, but we've already brought up the hippies and the crusties.
Hmm.
So straight edge lifestyle. We've drawn some modern parallels, tied it in with futurism a little bit. Also noted the differences. Um, so yeah, we talked a lot after that section. Are we ready to move on to
Yeah.
part three? Okay. Sec. Collapse of the Romainville Commune. The first murmurings of discontent came over the question of communal eating and the ideological correctness of one's diet. Some consternation was caused by Victor and Moret's refusal to give up on tea and coffee. They grew irritated by the salt and pepperless vegetarian diet and sat at the communal table less and less frequently. Soon the two of them were dining separately and were declared by some of the others to be insufficiently evolved. There were disagreements over the contents of the paper. Victor refused, as de facto editor, to insert an article by Garnier entitled Salt is Poison, and was annoyed at altercations made to articles by Raymond. As illegalism increasingly became an article of faith for Octave Garnier and Edward Carroy, their denunciations of Victor as a do-nothing intellectual and armchair anarchist became more virulent. One day in the last week of August, Edward Carroy suddenly disappeared from Romainville. He He had apparently been denounced to the police as an accomplice in an attempted burglary in the suburb of Maison-Alfort on the night of 23rd, 24th August, in the course of which 2 men had been arrested. Jean gathered up their belongings and herself left 2 days later. 8 days after this, in the first week of September, Octave and Marie, Renee, and Anna, as well as Raymond, all decamped for equally mysterious locations, but presumably back to Paris. This left just Victor, Rirette, the 2 kids, and Huck the gardener. Edward Carroy was obviously worried that if he stayed, he might be picked up for the Maison-Alfort job. And if his real identity was discovered, he would also face extradition for the attempted murder of the policeman in Charleroi. He had tasted prison life and was determined not to return there under any circumstances. He and Jean rented a small, typically suburban pavilion from a teacher in Saint-Thibault-les-Vignes, further west of Romainville, on the river Marne. He rented the place in the name of Raoul Leblanc, the name of the author of Arsène Lupin, a novel based on the exploits of the anarchist burglar Marius Jacob. The other comrades departed from Romainville, encouraged by the arrests of certain of Octave's friends in July, and triggered by the hasty departure of Edward. Beside this, they were evidently not getting on too well with Victor and Rirette. Victor still got on with Renee, and Raymond was an old friend, but it seems that they were both now under the influence of Octave and his mentor, Edward. In the wake of the latter's departure, and given his dislike for Victor, it seems most plausible that it was Octave Garnier who suggested that the rest of them leave. He also had other schemes in mind. In his memoirs, however, Victor Kobalchich recalled a split on theoretical lines. He said that, as a condition of his taking up the editorship of the paper, the previous editing and printing staff, whose leading light was Raymond, should get out, and I should be allowed to recruit my own colleagues. Nevertheless, for a month, 2 staffs coexisted, the old one and mine. He had wanted to give L'Anarchy a new emphasis, in the form of a turn from individualism to social action, whereas it could be said that those who had left were to make a turn from individualism to antisocial action. It has even been suggested that he began to lead some sort of campaign against illegalism, which he said was a theory that had emerged out of Armand's spluttering. In fact, Armand had very little to do with illegalism. Despite having written a play called The Illegalists, he had edited L'Air Nouvelle, New Era, for the previous 10 years, a mainly Tolstoyan pacifist journal, since turned to individualist anarchism. He had lived in Orleans for over a year, a town much favored by criminals banned from living in Paris due to its proximity to the capital, from where he was about to start publication of a new magazine called Hors du Troupeau, Outside of the Herd. He had written a few casual justifications of illegalism, but then so had most anarchist individualists, including Victor himself. The latter's later disagreements with Armand seem to have clouded his memory somewhat. Further problems with Kobalch's story are raised given the following article, which appeared on the inside pages of L'Anarchy between the time of Carroy's disappearance and the departure of the other 5 comrades. It was entitled Considerations on the Present State of Anarchist Propaganda and Action, and its author was Lorillot. He came out firmly against illegalism as some sort of anarchist panacea that could remedy social injustice. He suggested that in its pride, brutality, and lack of intelligence, the mentality of the illegalist could be no more than a mirror image of the mentality of a stupid cop. Comrades full of pride, vanity, and perverted temperaments, doing everything to profit themselves, were bad propagandists and bad comrades. He was against swindling, exploitation, and laziness, and for reason, education, and conscience. Some comrades were guilty of such vile acts as defrauding comrades and parasitism, yet they presented the illegalist alone as a true anarchist, and boasted of their exploits, unaware that this playing to the gallery and loose talk could easily put the police on their trail and endanger others. Lorillot saw the individualism as perverted, with a tendency to embourgeoisement, the same impulsiveness which can make rebels The same impulsiveness which can make rebels can also make them unsuited for real comradeship. For my part, I would not want to assume the responsibility of leading naive youths to do acts for which they are unprepared, and who tomorrow would be victims of their own stupidity and my own blindness. It's not hard to see why Lorillot left Romainville. He must have had violent arguments with Garnier, Carroy, and their supporters, although he kept his strongest words until after he was back in Paris. Nevertheless, it was up to Kovalchich as de facto editor to see that the article went in, although it would have been difficult to refuse space to the former editor. The article was obviously directed against the comrades in Romainville, and its insertion in L'Anarchy must have led to further recriminations between them and Victor Kovalchich, despite the fact that he did not agree with the contents. Indeed, he welcomed a reply written by Levieux that treated Lorillot's article as verging on the hysterical and compared his argument to pro-legality line put forward by Jean Grave in Temple Nouveau. Levieux denied that everything illegal was presented as an anarchist act by illegalist comrades, and described imprisoned comrades as victims of the law, not of illegalism. The risks of resignation were as great, if not worse, than the risks of revolt. By October, Lorillot was calm enough to accept that illegal actions were a necessity imposed by society, but that illegalism could only be a last resort. The surprising thing about all this is that Kovalchich later put himself in the role of Lorillot, as leading a campaign against illegalism and for social action, something which forced a split between him and his erstwhile comrades. On the evidence or inferences from such, this story seems untenable. There was no turn from individualism to social action. Le Retif was consistent in his articles from the time of revolt until his arrest the following year. He committed any burglaries or acts of armed resistance. He remained an intellectual, and it was probably this, combined with his unscientific diet, which caused the hostility between him and the illegalists. After Carroy's departure, the insertion of Lorillot's article was the final straw, and under the dominating influence of Octave Garnier, the others quit L'Anarchy. So that concludes that portion. Thoughts on Romainville breaking up?
It's not surprising at all.
I think it's funny that one of the initial causes was people were sick of eating the scientific diet. They wanted salt and pepper.
Mm-hmm.
They still like coffee and tea. It's not that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that
right.
bad. Yeah, they
it
broke
makes
edge.
life dull.
Exactly. It doesn't really sound appealing to me at all.
Yeah, and also we have to remember they're egoists. They want to do what they want to do.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
How are you supposed to impose dietary rules on individualist anarchists?
You can't.
I don't get how that works.
Yeah,
Well,
you can't.
Well, it's kind of like Zizek talks about two different methods of control. The first method is the traditional overbearing, forceful method, where essentially a state uses state power and then the police in order to intimidate and force people to do things. But the second method he calls the neoliberal method of control, in which the neoliberal method of control is that it doesn't use force to enforce its rules. It almost uses propaganda and tries to convince the other people to want to follow the rules.
Yeah, the good Foucault gets onto a lot of that, and even the American technocracy movement got on that. So
yeah,
but Zizek uses the ideology of two parents. You have to go, or you know what? You should go see your the new postmodern liberal parent would say, well, you should go see your grandmother because she'll be sad if you don't. Although really, either way, you still have to go see your grandmother. And there will be consequences.
Yeah, it's either through threat of force or they try to convince you.
The movement away from the body.
Did Ziza take influence from Antonio Gramsci?
I don't know too much about Zizek. I don't think about him.
Yeah, I don't. I don't
I've
really
seen clips. So
yeah, I've never read anything by Zizek. I've only seen his interviews and lectures.
I haven't even seen a full one. I've just seen clips.
I'm the same
Yeah.
way. I
Like I
watch them on
remember,
YouTube sometimes, but
yeah, I remember like the Jordan Peterson Zizek debate. Like Zizek in the middle of it said he told like communists like we shouldn't go back to Marx. Instead, we should like go back to Hegel instead of like just going back to Marx,
I
which a lot of
agree. I
communists
agree
want to
with that.
do.
I've even told fascists that they should do that. I think fascists, anarchists, and Marxists should all just go back to Hegel and look back there. Like really, everything in that Hegel, that significant in Marx, it goes back to Hegel. Marxist analysis of class ultimately goes back to Hegel's analysis of master-slave, where, in case you don't know the Hegelian master-slave dialectic, you have the sort of battle for for domination. One ends up winning; he becomes the master, but the master and the slave, while they both need each other to actualize themselves, the slave has the greater ability for actualization. So as the slave achieves a greater actualization over the master, at that point he is able to rise above the master and replace him. And that's sort of the Marxist analysis of class. Just replace master and slave with bourgeois and proletariat.
Yeah,
agreed.
Zizek also said like he prefers like the forceful method of control rather than the postmodern neoliberal method of control. His opinion, because it's
But
more
back,
honest.
Yeah,
but back to the illegalists, I think they would reject both.
yeah.
Like
They
to them,
would.
it's like do whatever the fuck you want. It doesn't matter.
Well, there's actually some ties with primitivism because when you get to this point where you can't really build like functioning societies, functioning technological societies under this view, because this technology necessarily creates bureaucracy and authority.
Well, you can build these like utopian communes that fall apart in a few
Yeah.
months.
But
Um,
so there's sort of tie between egoism and primitivism because Ted Kaczynski just sort of notices, and this is sort of the meta point of Ted Kaczynski, is that technology restricts human individual freedom.
Yeah.
And so
Eh,
the egoist, if as soon as he notices that, he's gonna want to revolt against technology to some extent.
Yeah, and Kaczynski also said as technology gets better, it becomes harder for people to revolt against the system because it gets better at countering this. So that too.
Mhm.
And that's kind of like, but what you're saying about like the connections between egoism and primitivism a little bit ago, I have to agree with you. That's like my biggest criticism of illegalism is that it doesn't actually build a functional society.
Yeah, egoism is either just sort of your total individual revolt, or if you're trying to repeal to maximize the liberty of all individuals, you necessarily have to collapse into primitivism.
Yeah, it deconstructs society.
And then at that point, you're just going to redo what you did before. And primitive society necessarily also creates hierarchies. It creates a chief of the clan, a leader, so on and so forth.
indeed.
And that Ted Kaczynski responds to the anarcho-primitivist along those lines. Primitive societies were very hierarchical. They had a lot of things that the anarcho-primitivist would view as unethical. Ted Kaczynski even goes to cite examples of rape that weren't viewed as rape in those times.
Yeah, like it seems like a lot of them have like a similar view that Marx had, is that like they were like primitive. It was primitive communism.
I actually agree with the concept of primitive communism. I think that primitive societies were essentially communistic in a sense. But
Yeah,
Marx
and
wasn't advocating for primitive communism.
yeah, I'm not saying that he did. He was a complete
It
industrial.
was just something that he pointed out, is that people in the past held property communally,
Yeah, he
which
wanted the
is
progression
true.
of technology.
Should I start
Yeah,
reading the final part, or does anyone have final thoughts?
yeah, you can continue.
Okay. Paris again. Soon a new disaster overtook Anarchy. There was an accident with the printing machine that reduced the 14th September issue to only one page. Within a couple of weeks, the Marinoni press had packed up almost completely, and it was not known whether the fault was repairable. There was no money to go to another printer's to print a proper issue and publication of Le Retifs Against Hunger, and La View's anti-militarist pamphlet would have to be postponed. The crisis was serious enough to warrant a special meeting on the following Sunday to discuss the whole question of the future of the journal. On top of this, the bookshop, a principal source of income, was selling less and less. Being stuck out in Suburbia was losing them both financial and physical support. With the press broken, it was decided that the situation in Romainville was hopeless, and it would be better to return to Paris. Rirette scouted around for somewhere suitable and came up with a small place in the Rue Fessard, near Bout-Chamont, which overlooked Paris from the east. The first edition of L'Anarchy, sporting the new address, came out on the 19th of October. A week later, the bookshop was moved to Paris as well. In the capital, however, the atmosphere was stifling. The revolutionary movement was deadlocked, the organized section of the working class having been bludgeoned into temporary submission. I'm getting a lot of background noise. Can you guys mute your mics while I'm reading? All right, sorry about that. Where was I? In the capital, however, the atmosphere was stifling. The revolutionary movement was deadlocked, the organized section of the working class having been bludgeoned into temporary submission since the defeat of the railwaymen's strike. Kibalchich wrote, "We breathe the oppressive air of the prelude to war. Imperialist squabbles ran their course towards the impending catastrophe of the First World War, the Agadir incident, the partition of Morocco, the massacre at Casablanca, the Turkish-Italian War, the Austrian annexation of Bosnia, the build-up to the Balkan Wars, and the feverish arms race between the great powers. The revolutions in China and Mexico were greeted with enthusiasm, but simply highlighted the sense of impotence of revolutionaries in seemingly tranquil Europe. At L'Anarchy, however, life went on, despite some fuss with the building's proprietor over the mall. 3 new pamphlets were printed, one on free love, Le Retifs Against Hunger, and Mauritius on the social role of the anarchists. The causerie went on as usual with Lorillot, Kibalchich, and Mauritius as the main speakers. Lorillot announced that the first issue of ID Libraire would appear on December the 1st. Few, if any, of the old comrades visited Victor and Rirette at Rue Fessard. Marius Medj popped in occasionally, and Andre Saudi made a reappearance. The tuberculosis young Saudi had some very bad luck. While in hospital in 1910, he'd let a friend use his garret, and the friend had subsequently given his address when caught thieving. The place was searched and stolen goods found. Saudi was taken from the hospital bed and charged with receiving. His sentence was 8 months in prison and 5 years exile from Paris. His previous convictions for insulting police, resisting arrest, and distributing leaflets in the course of a strike at the big grocery stores were taken into account. He was released on 24th of August. He went to the new premises of L'Anarchy. Saudi enjoyed taking Maud and Chanette for walks in the pretty little park on the Bout-Chamont, where with few centimeters he would buy them sweets. The kids called him La Bechamel, white sauce, due to his very pale complexion. He was still ill, but could not afford to go to the seaside health resort at Berwick, where he sometimes went for a cure. Instead, Rirette booked him into the Parisian sanatorium at Brevin, under the false name of Colombo, because he was officially forbidden to be resident in the capital. Edward Carroy had meanwhile dyed his hair from red to black and was living off the 30 to 40 francs a week he made by selling false jewelry and trinkets in the suburban markets. On his travels, he also kept his eyes open for places that could easily be burgled. In his little handcart, he had a secret drawer containing the necessary tools of the trade. His main partner in crime, Marius Medj, had hired a small detached house in Garchet, in the western suburbs, where he lived with his girlfriend, Barbe Leclerc. an illiterate Breton from the wilds of Morbihan, who knew some of the illegalists from Charleroi. Together, then, Caroy and Medj got to know both the eastern and western suburbs in Paris. And over the 2 months following L'Anarchy's departure from Romainville, they burgled houses in Alfortville, Pavillon sous Bois, and Ruelle Maison, a shop in Chateau, the Société Electro-Industrial, and the post office in Romainville. Caroy also found some part-time work with an anarchist locksmith, Louis Rimbaud, who ran a garage in Pavillon sous Bois, Rue Boulevard. He was a friend of Victor Coissac, later to be the organizer of a well-known and long-lived commune, L'Integrat. Rameau himself had just come in the summer of 1911 from the Bastion Libertarian colony near Chateau Thierry. Having failed to drum up any enthusiasm for his Proudhonist-inspired plans for the workers in the region, he was 34 years old. Octave Garnier and his companion Marie were now staying at his mother's house at 42 Rue de la Terre in Vincennes. Raymond Lascience, René Vallée, and Anna were staying with various friends in Paris, sometimes with their old comrade from Brussels and Romainville, Jean Debeau, who was working with Lorillot on his new magazine. Louis Dudon was still with him, and in August Eugene married to try and convince her to come back to him, and their child. He talked to the other comrades, who being at odds with Lorillot were sympathetic to him, but he soon returned to Nancy, promising to come back again later in the year. Whether Octave, Raymond, René, and the others visit him is unclear. In Paris, they often went to concerts. Raymond loved Chopin especially, or the theater together, but in general their activities remain obscure. Garnier continued to work as a Navy and card-carrying CGT member on the construction of a second railway line between Pontoise and Dieppe. He was involved in strikes at Chars, Marines, and Cergy, where he met at the Poissy-Vaureal tram line. He was sentenced to a few weeks' prison for assault, insulting behavior, and incitement to murder during a construction workers' strike. He worked next at Achères, then at Maison Lafitte, leaving suddenly after the death of a scab named Merck on 13th November. In his memoirs, scribbled in school exercise books, Garnier recalled these as days when we didn't have much money. We carried out burglary upon burglary, of which I can mention the principal ones, which were those in the months of August, September, and October 1911. In August, we did several, which each brought in 300 or 400 francs, a post office which brought us 700 francs, and a villa in Nantes which gave us 4,000 francs. But besides those, we did several others which didn't bring in much. In the 2 months of September and October, our principal burglary was that of the post office in Chelles in the department of Seine-et-Marne, which brought in 4,000 francs, and a few others of lesser importance. Lastly, towards the beginning of November, we did another one in Compiègne, which got us 3,500 francs. It was a good haul, but this money was soon spent, as many of our comrades, having been hassled by the police or other people, had been given financial help. Clearly, Octave was dissatisfied. During that autumn, he, René, and Raymond discussed together ways of making the cry of our revolt be heard more strongly than ever. Garnier wanted to do something on a much bigger scale and had already arranged the renting of several safe houses. He admired Caroy's cool professionalism, but felt that he lacked imagination. Raymond and René could be relied upon to back him up, but it was he, Octave, who would have to come up with the plan. For once, Raymond was right. They must put science at the service of their revolt. They must have the best tools, the best weapons, and a fast car. Then they could be prepared to make their attack upon society. They had the know-how to steal a car, but only Octave had had a few lessons. I looked for a mate to act as driver, but in vain. I had learnt to drive, but not yet being very good at it. Still hesitated to rush out and steal a car in order to pull off a job that would keep us free from want for a good time. At this point, I became acquainted with Bonnot, and that's where chapter 4 ends. Chapter 5 will be about Jules Bonnot, who the Bonnot gang is obviously named after. So,
Yeah, the head honcho.
That'll be in 2 weeks.
Everything else has just sort of been leading up to it.
Yeah, it's setting the stage, introducing some of the characters, and yeah.
Characters and ideas, although the ideas were sort of expounded out in the first two.
True. Yeah, and some of the early precursor figures like Albert Libertad, who I did like I would recommend reading him. Someone, I saw a tweet. I'm gonna try and find it. Someone like drew parallels between the Bonnot gang and cyberpunk. It kind of has the high tech, low life, low culture, high tech, or whatever, like that. Like they did embrace new technologies like the car to do crime more effectively and better.
Yeah, that's just the last section you just read.
Yeah, it did definitely remind me of the tweet. Here it is from Dos Ferrado. Jules Bonnot and his eponymous gang, John Dillinger et al., and the various other motorized criminals of the 1910s and 20s embody the cyberpunk ethos of high-tech low-life, just as well as the genre's canonical figures, cyborgs, hackers, etc. I just thought it was an interesting parallel to draw between like something more current and these criminals from 1910s and 20s.
I know this was in the last section, but I found it interesting how a lot of the egoists announced, what's his name, Victor? Victor for being like a chair intellectual, which is kind of interesting because a lot of the socialists and anarchists were having those criticisms of each other at a similar time.
Well, egoists have never really been chair intellectuals. From Novateur, you can read him. He's very undisciplined and compared to like an armchair intellectual in the language he uses.
Yeah, he was in and out of prison all the time. He burnt down churches and engaged in crime and theft.
But like he uses the term not really egoism, but individualist anarchism. He uses that a lot to sort of describe him, which sort of goes against normal anarchism. Some armchair would point that out, but he's not. He doesn't care, and he constantly attacks armchairs.
Yeah, the Victor guy does seem like a bit of an armchair, in my opinion. Like he just writes and publishes articles, counter signals criminal activity, which I don't know. It's clear that there is a split. That is the reason the Romainville commune didn't work out. Some of them are like all theory, no action. I think the criticism could be made that the illegalists are all action, lack of theory.
Yeah, I would agree.
That note was made at the beginning of this book. There's no evidence the Bonnot gang ever read Stirner.
Yeah. They commit crime out of necessity. Money's hard to come by. Jobs don't pay enough. Like that makes sense to me.
Yeah. But that ended up becoming their downfall in the end. Like, not to give like too many spoilers, and it did cause the state to crack down on anarchist activity in general at that time.
Yeah. It's still an interesting story, nonetheless. And I do think there is something admirable and noble about the anarchist bank robbers. There's some romanticism to it that I do like. I don't know. I've always kind of been into true crime and gangsters and bank robbers and shit like that.
They were part of the wave of revolutionary ideologies that were action-orientated, like the futurists and syndicalists and the fascists and the Leninists.
Well, that sort of whole period was a very strong wave for a lot of revolutionary ideologies, just like the Enlightenment.
Right.
Yeah. So, final thoughts before we wrap up?
I enjoy it like always.
Yeah, it's good.
Yep. Thanks for coming on, guys. Thanks for listening, everybody. We'll be back next weekend, and we'll be reading and discussing the Conservative Revolution in Russia by Alexander Dugin. So that should be a good episode. A little different from what the kind of content we normally do, but CSD really wanted to do it. It should be interesting. I'm not too familiar with the subject, so should be educational for me, and I hope whoever decides to watch and listen to it. But until then, thanks for listening. See you guys later. Salute.